Homecoming. The rain was a cold, insistent drizzle, a relentless whisper against the windshield of Liam's rented sedan as he drove into Blackwood, Pennsylvania. The old steel town, once a titan of industry, now felt like a mausoleum. He hadn't been back in 5 years, not since he'd left for college with a scholarship and a suitcase full of dreams. Now, he was coming home for a funeral. His father's. Liam slowed down as he passed the rusted skeleton of the Blackwood steel mill. It was a carcass, a monument to a past that had evaporated, taking with it the town's spirit and 1,000 jobs. This was where his father David had spent his life. His sweat and blood poured into the furnaces. This was where, according to the official report, his father had ended it all. The funeral had been a blur of somber faces and empty condolences. Everyone, the neighbors, the old union buddies, even the police officer who'd found the body, had the same story. David was a good man, but he couldn't handle the loss of the mill, the unemployment, the shame, the loneliness. It made sense, they said. It was a tragedy, but a predictable one. But as Liam stood by his father's grave, the words felt hollow. The man he knew was not one to surrender. David was a fighter, a man who found pride in hard work and grit in adversity. The thought of him hanging a rope in the silence of the abandoned mill felt like a betrayal of his character, a story that didn't fit. Later that evening, in his father's quiet and strangely tidy house, Liam found himself walking through the rooms, a ghost in his own memories. He ran a hand over the worn armchair where his father would read the paper, the wood smooth from decades of use. The air was heavy, not with dust, but with an unspoken grief. He saw a man who had planned for the future, not one who was ready to leave it. There were bills, neatly stacked on the kitchen counter, grocery lists taped to the fridge. He even found a small note, "Pick up milk," scrawled in his father's familiar handwriting. None of it felt like the actions of a man on the brink of despair. In the workshop, a place filled with the familiar smells of sawdust and motor oil, photos brimming with life and a mischievous glint in his eyes, was not the man the town had described as defeated. He moved on to his father's office, a small cramped room dominated by a solid oak desk. Everything was exactly as David had left it, a half-empty cup of coffee, a half-filled crossword puzzle, a single pen resting beside it. It was here, in the quiet order of the room, that Liam began to feel a shift. The feeling of grief was slowly giving way to something colder, more focused, a deep, simmering anger. He began with the desk drawers. The top one held a scattering of paper clips and old business cards. The second, stacks of neatly organized tax returns and insurance documents. Liam's hand brushed against the back of the third drawer and felt a slight resistance. He pulled it out completely and saw a small hidden compartment. Inside, nestled amongst some old, brittle papers, was a worn, leather-bound journal. The journal was his father's. The handwriting, once so familiar, was now a strange, unsettling script. It wasn't a diary, but a ledger of sorts. The first few pages listed names of colleagues and their families, with notes on their children's birthdays and anniversaries, a testament to his father's unwavering empathy. But as Liam turned the pages, the tone changed. Dates were marked with cryptic codes, and names like Frank and Jack appeared repeatedly, often followed by a negative symbol or a question mark. The entries grew more frequent in the weeks leading up to the mill's closing, each one more frantic and desperate than the last. He saw mention of secret meetings, investors, and the final deal. Liam's heart pounded against his ribs. He felt a chilling certainty wash over him. This was not the journal of a man contemplating suicide. This was the journal of a man under threat. Beneath the journal, a small black USB drive lay concealed. It was unmarked, unassuming. His fingers trembled as he held it. He walked over to his father's old, bulky computer, a relic from a bygone era. He plugged the drive in, the soft click echoing in the silent room. The screen flickered to life, showing a prompt for a password. Liam tried his father's name, the mill's name, the names of his friends. Nothing. Just as he was about to give up, a thought flashed in his mind. He typed in his balding head and a perpetually nervous energy looked a decade older than he did in Liam's memories. Jack, bulkier and with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes, clapped Liam on the shoulder with a gesture that felt more like possession than comfort. "Good to see you, son," Frank said, his voice a low rumble. "We've all been torn up about David. He was one of us." Liam nodded, his gaze fixed on their faces, searching for a crack in the facade. He ordered a black coffee, just like his father used to. The simple act felt like a silent defiance. They talked about the funeral, the weather, and the slow, painful decline of the town. The conversation was a carefully navigated minefield of small talk, but Liam steered it toward the steel mill. "I was looking through Dad's things," Liam began, his voice steady. "Found some old journals. He mentioned you guys a lot, especially in the last few weeks." A flicker of something, was it panic, crossed Frank's eyes before he quickly masked it. Jack's forced smile tightened. "David was a writer, always had a notebook," Jack said, his laugh a little too loud. "He was probably just venting about the union, the stress of the mill closing." "No," Liam said, his voice gaining an edge. "These weren't just notes. They were about the deal, the investment group that bought the mill. It sounds like he was worried about something." A heavy silence descended upon their table, broken only by the clinking of a spoon in a coffee cup from a nearby booth. Frank shifted in his seat, avoiding Liam's eyes. "Listen, Liam," Frank said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Your father he was going through a tough time. The stress, you know. He got some ideas in his head. Imagined things." "Imagined what?" Liam pressed. "He wrote about being betrayed. He wrote about a bribe." Jack slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the diner. "That's enough, Liam. Your father wasn't well. You need to let this go. It's a tragedy, but you have to move on." The anger in Jack's voice was not that of a grieving friend. It was the anger, their forced sympathy, their panicked aversions. It all confirmed what his gut had been telling him from the start. Liam returned to the study, the small USB drive feeling heavy in his palm. He slid it into the old computer's port, the faint click echoing in the stillness. The screen glowed, a password prompt blinking in the center. He had tried everything, his father's name, the mill's name, their family dog's name. It wasn't about a simple word. It was a test, a final message from a man who knew he might not be around to deliver it himself. His father had always been a man of simple gestures, of meaning hidden in plain sight. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. His 10th birthday. His father had given him a tool set, and on the box he had scrawled, "The best locks are opened with the simplest keys." It was a cheesy line, but it was pure David. Liam took a deep breath. What was the most important key? His birthday. The day he came into the world. The day his father's life as a parent truly began. He typed in his own birth date, a simple string of numbers. The screen went black for a moment, and then a folder appeared. The title was a single word. Truth. He clicked on it. Inside there was an organized collection of files, documents, email chains, and audio recordings. He opened the first file, an old email with an attachment. It was a draft of a contract, full of legal jargon, but the key phrase was unmistakable. The Blackwood Steel Mill Asset Sale. The names of Frank and Jack were listed as key advisors. Liam's hands trembled as he scrolled down. The document laid out a series of secret consulting fees, which were clearly payoffs, promised to his father's closest friends in exchange for their support in the sale. His father's name was notably absent from this part of the agreement. He opened the next file, an audio recording. He clicked play, and the low, staticky voices of Frank and Jack filled the room. The conversation was cold, transactional. They were talking about the mill, not as a source of livelihood for their community, but as a commodity. They discussed how David cut in. You're getting in the way. Don't be a hero, David. It's not worth it. The recording ended abruptly. There was no mention of suicide, no final farewell. Just silence. Liam closed his eyes, the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. The police had been lazy, perhaps complacent. Frank and Jack had used their community standing to spin a narrative that the town, heartbroken and desperate, had been all too willing to believe. But the truth was here, on this little black drive, a time capsule of their conspiracy. The suicide was a carefully crafted lie, and he now held the key to unlocking the true story of his father's death. The grief had finally given way, replaced by a cold, searing fire of purpose. Liam drove out of the old industrial part of town, the bitter taste of truth on his tongue. The setting sun cast long, bruised shadows over the dilapidated brick buildings, and the air was thick with the ghost of progress and a sense of profound loss. But for the first time since his father's death, Liam wasn't consumed by sadness. The raw, aching grief had been replaced by a focused, white-hot fury. It was a cold emotion, sharp and precise, a tool he could now use. He parked his car at the highest point of Blackwood Hill, a spot that overlooked the entire town and the silent, rusted skeleton of the steel mill. This was where his father had brought him as a boy, to show him the city that his grandfather and his father had built, the one they were proud to call home. Now it was a tomb, and his father, a man of honor, was its victim. Liam sat on the hood of his car, the cold metal seeping through his clothes. He clutched the USB drive in his hand, its small weight a constant reminder of the truth. He replayed the audio file in his mind, the casual betrayal in Frank and Jack's voices, the dismissive cruelty. They hadn't just taken his father's life, they had taken his dignity, his legacy, and the reputation he had worked a lifetime to build. The town had bought their lie, swallowed it whole, and now would make them suffer the same loss his father had suffered. He would take away everything they had, their reputations, their families, and their fortune. He would dismantle their lives piece by piece, just as they had done to his father's. Liam drove back to his father's house, the plan already taking shape in his mind. The grief was gone, replaced by a chilling clarity. The mission was set. He had a motive, he had the evidence, and now he had the fire of a son's vengeance burning in his soul. This wouldn't be a search for justice. This was a calculated campaign of retribution, a cold, long game of revenge that would end only when the last light of Frank and Jack's lives had been extinguished. Liam set up his command center in the quiet sanctuary of his father's old workshop. The scent of sawdust and motor oil, once a source of comfort, now fueled his cold, calculated resolve. He was no longer a grieving son. He was an architect of ruin. The tools on the workbench, chisels, saws, hammers, were not for building anymore, but for dismantling. His tools were digital, his targets human. He had spent the last 2 days meticulously studying the documents and audio files from the USB drive, cross-referencing names, dates, and account numbers. He mapped out the intricate web of Frank and Jack's business dealings, their shell companies, their offshore accounts, their investments in the very kind of properties that had once destroyed the mill. His first target was their reputation. Liam knew he couldn't just go to the police. Frank and Jack's connections ran deep, and they would simply dismiss him as a vengeful son consumed by grief. He needed to be invisible, to work from the shadows. He created an untraceable email address and a new online persona, a whistleblower who claimed to have insider knowledge of corporate fraud. He began to send anonymous tips to online financial news. Deep-seated distrust and greed between Frank and Jack. Liam exploited it. He started sending forged emails, impersonating each man to the other's business partners. One email from Frank to Jack's main investor raised questions about Jack's financial stability. Another, from Jack to one of Frank's key contractors, hinted at a secret side deal that Frank was making behind his back. The emails were laced with just enough truth to be believable. The confusion began to spread, slowly at first, then rapidly escalating. Phone calls were made, meetings were canceled, and whispers began to turn into heated accusations. Liam, watching from a distance, saw the cracks forming in their partnership. He was not a man of violence, but he was a master of chaos. He was not swinging a hammer. He was placing invisible wedges, one after another, until the whole structure began to crumble under its own weight. He looked at the half-finished birdhouse on his father's workbench, a symbol of a life cut short. He knew that for Frank and Jack, the house was not a project, but a cage of their own making, and he, a ghost in the machine, was about to lock them inside. Cracks in the facade. The first sign of success was a frantic phone call from Frank to Jack. Liam, through a simple and carefully placed listening device he'd hidden in the diner booth, heard the conversation unfold.
Did you see the latest review on the Revival website?
Frank's voice was thin, edged with panic.
Someone posted a photo of a cracked foundation. They're saying it's shoddy work. It's just one person, Frank, probably a competitor.
Jack retorted, but his voice lacked conviction.
It's not just one. I'm getting emails from my investors asking about a secret agreement that's going to hit our profits. They're asking if you're holding out on them.
The conversation escalated, devolving into mutual accusations. Frank was convinced Jack was double-crossing him. Jack was certain Frank was spreading rumors to undermine his side of the business. The seeds of distrust Liam had planted were now sprouting into a full-blown argument, a poison seeping into the partnership. A few days later, Liam saw Frank at the grocery store. The man who had always carried him, referencing intimate details only an insider would know. The next day, Liam saw Sarah's car parked at a lawyer's office. He watched as she walked out, her shoulders slumped, her expression a mask of betrayal. Jack's world was being torn apart not just professionally, but personally. The best part of the plan was how he remained invisible. They were so consumed by their mutual accusations and the public-facing disasters that they never once considered an outside force. They were too proud, too arrogant to believe anyone could outsmart them. The town, too, was caught up in the drama. Gossip spread like wildfire of failed deals, marital strife, and whispers of financial ruin. The narrative of Frank and Jack as respected businessmen was quickly unraveling, replaced by the reality of two greedy, paranoid men consumed by their own actions. Liam, in his silent workshop, felt a grim satisfaction. He was watching his revenge take root, a slow, methodical poison. He wasn't raising a hand against them. He was simply pulling the threads of their lives and watching their carefully constructed world fall to pieces. The final strike. The rumors were no longer whispers. They were a full-blown roar. The whispers of Frank and Jack's impending financial ruin were now front-page news in the local Blackwood paper. Liam knew the time was right for the final strike. The two men were already teetering on the edge, their empire of lies and greed crumbling. Liam logged into his anonymous accounts, a ghost in the machine. He had spent weeks preparing this part of the plan. He had compiled a dossier of all the evidence, the damning email chains, the fraudulent contracts, the audio recordings of their conversations, and even some of the digital forged documents he'd used to sow discord. He had meticulously scrubbed the metadata, ensuring there were no digital footprints leading back to him. He chose a prominent national news outlet known for its investigative journalism and the local reporter who had once been a good friend of his father. He sent the full package to both, a chilling, complete narrative of betrayal, fraud, and a fabricated suicide. Next, Liam turned his attention to the stock market. He used a sophisticated of Blackwood was in shock. People who had once respected the two men now stared at them with disgust and betrayal. Families of the displaced mill workers who had always believed David's death was a tragic suicide now had a name to their anger. Liam sat in his father's empty house, watching the news reports flood his screen. He saw Frank and Jack, their faces pale and defeated, being hounded by reporters outside their homes. He saw their wives, their lives now torn apart, and felt a moment of satisfaction. It was a grim feeling, but it was there nonetheless. He had taken everything from them, their reputations, their businesses, and their sense of security. The revenge was complete, but as he sat in the silent house, the weight of his actions began to settle in. The fire of his anger was gone, replaced by a cold, unsettling emptiness. He had destroyed the men who had betrayed his father, but the void they left behind could not be filled. The world around Frank and Jack collapsed, not with a bang, but with a series of frantic, desperate phone calls and the relentless flash of cameras. News crews descended upon Blackwood, swarming their homes and offices, a swarm of vultures picking at the carcass of their reputations. Liam watched from a safe distance, a quiet spectator to the chaos he had orchestrated. Frank, the eternally nervous one, was the first to break. His family, once a picture of suburban bliss, shattered under the pressure. His wife, who had no knowledge of his crimes, was publicly humiliated. His children were bullied at school, a direct consequence of their father's greed. Frank was seen on the local news, his face gaunt and pale, being escorted out of his office by federal investigators. He had lost everything: his business, his family, his dignity. In his desperation, he tried to shift the blame to Jack, leaking fabricated stories to the press about Jack being the true mastermind. Jack, always the more arrogant and composed of the two, refused to yield. He hired a high-powered legal team and attempted to sue the news outlets for defamation, but Liam's evidence was too solid, too meticulously curated. The audio recordings of him and Frank discussing David's problem and the subsequent payoffs were undeniable. The weight of the evidence and Frank's desperate attempts to save himself drove a final wedge between the foundation of betrayal, a foundation that was now crumbling under the weight of its own deceit. They had stolen his father's honor and dignity, and in return, Liam had systematically stripped them of their own. They weren't just facing legal consequences, they were facing a social and moral judgment that was far more devastating. The men who had believed they were untouchable were now completely exposed, their secrets laid bare for the world to see. Liam stood on Blackwood Hill, looking down at the town he had just rocked to its core. He felt a grim satisfaction, a sense of righting a terrible wrong. The scales of justice had been tipped, not by a court of law, but by a son who had sworn to avenge his father. But as the satisfaction settled, a new question began to form in the emptiness left behind. What now? The revenge was complete, but the feeling of loss still lingered, a phantom limb that he would have to learn to live with. High conversation. The old steel mill stood in the gray light of dawn, a monument to a forgotten age. Liam stood at its rusted gates, a gust of wind rattling the chain-link fence. The air was cold, tasting of rust and decay. He had sent a message, not an email or a text, but a simple, old-fashioned letter to both Frank and Jack, requesting a final meeting at the place where it all began. He knew they would come. They had nothing left to lose, and in their state of ruin, they were desperate for an explanation. They arrived separately, their appearances a stark contrast to the men Liam had met at the diner. Frank looked defeated, his suit rumpled, his face a roadmap of stress and fear. He eyed Liam with a mix of hatred and resignation. Jack, in a worn work jacket, had a furious fire in his eyes, but it was the fire of a man who had been outmatched. His arrogance had been replaced by a simmering, impotent rage. "You," Jack spat, pointing a trembling finger at Liam. "You did this, all of it. Why?" Liam didn't answer right away. He walked toward the main entrance of the mill, the two men following him like dogs on a leash. He stopped at the very spot where his father's body had been found, a place now marked by a small, vast, empty space of the mill. Their own voices, full of cold ambition and cruel indifference, filled the silence. Frank slumped against a rusted beam, his face in his hands. The truth was out, not just to the world, but to them, in the one place they couldn't run from it. Jack's rage deflated, replaced by a hollow, defeated stare. "You took everything from us," Jack whispered, his voice cracking. "Everything we worked for." "You did that to yourselves," Liam replied, the finality in his tone chilling. "You chose greed over loyalty. You chose money over a man's life. The difference is, you lost your legacy. My father only lost his life, but I got his honor back." He looked at them, not with triumph, but with a profound, weary sadness. His vengeance was complete. They had their answer, and it was the cold, hard truth. He turned and walked away, leaving the two broken men alone with the ghosts they had created. The emptiness of victory. Frank and Jack's arrests were a spectacle. The news vans, the police cars, the flashing lights. It was a public, humiliating end to a life of deception. Liam watched it all unfold from a discreet distance, a spectator to the final act of his play. He saw their faces, no longer masked by arrogance or fear, but by a profound, hollow defeat. He saw them being led away in handcuffs, two men who had once seemed invincible, now reduced to common criminals. He should have felt a rush of triumph. This was what he had worked for, what he had meticulously planned. He had honored his vow, avenged his father's death, and exposed the truth to the world. But as the last police car drove away, an unsettling silence fell over the street. The thrill of victory was absent, replaced by a deep, aching emptiness. Liam returned to his father's house, a place that had once been filled with warmth and laughter, but now felt like a mausoleum. The silence was deafening. He walked through the future. He had become a man defined by a single purpose, and now that purpose was gone. He felt the weight of his actions, not just in the consequences for Frank and Jack, but in the consequences for himself. He had carried the burden of his vengeance for so long that he no longer knew how to exist without it. He had a family to mourn, a life to rebuild, and a soul to mend. But, in the quiet emptiness of his victory, he felt a profound sense of loneliness. He had won the battle, but he had lost the war for his own peace of mind. Months passed, and the media storm that had once consumed Blackwood had finally subsided. The town was slowly, painfully beginning to heal. Liam, too, had begun the slow process of rebuilding. He had sold his father's house, unable to bear the weight of its memories, and used the money to start a new life in a new city. He no longer felt the burning anger that had once defined him. It had been replaced by a quiet, persistent sadness. He took a job at a small tech company, a place where no one knew his name or his past. He spent his days writing code, creating things instead of destroying them. But the ghost of his father and the shadow of his vengeance followed him. He would often find himself staring at his computer screen, lost in thought, replaying the events in his mind. The victory felt hollow, the revenge an empty exercise. He had proven his father's innocence. But the truth did not bring him peace. One evening, he sat alone in his new apartment, looking through an old box of his father's things. He found a small, unfinished carving of a bird, the same one that had sat on his father's workbench. It was a simple, unfinished piece, a symbol of a life cut short. He picked it up and ran his thumb over the rough, unpolished wood. For the first time in a long time, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt a connection to his father, not as a victim but as a creator. He took out a small knife and began to work on the carving. He didn't know what he was doing at first, but his hands moved. Chapter, not out of vengeance, but out of a profound and quiet love.